Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, I'm glad you're here. Pull out a chair and get comfy because this video is going to be interesting. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you 8 ways to sew the bust cups in a corset so you can have options to choose from. You ready? Let's get into this. The first thing I want to show you is the original cut and sew bra foam. It comes in different colors. The way they made it is simple. Let me show you. They just put foam inside and they use cotton jersey fabric. They also put glue on the inside of the cotton jersey. It's really easy to make. This comes in different sizes. I have the thickest one, which is 5 millimeters, but they also make it in 3 millimeters and 2 millimeters. The more thicker it is, the more harder it is to sew when it's time to use the fabric, interfacing, and lining. You will see what I mean in a little while. So for method 1, I'm going to show you how to make this design on the top. This was requested by some of you, so let's do it together. This is the pattern for the fabric. It will be a 1/2 inch all the way around except for the top. The top is going to be 3/8 and 3/8. If you put 1/4 and 1/4, it will look smaller than this. And if you put a 1/2 inch and a 1/2 inch, it will look bigger than this. This size is perfect. So 3/8 and 3/8 is good. And for the foam, do not put seam allowance here, 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 and here. But put a 1/2 inch seam allowance here, 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 and here. In method 1, I'm going to show you how to sew it. So let's get started. Here are the fabric pieces I'm going to use in method 1. The pattern piece says sew it 3/8. And when we flip it over, it will be 3/8. Let's sew. When you finish, just check to see if it's 3/8. Before we turn it over, you're going to notice it's really puffy over here. And we don't want that to happen because it won't turn over nicely. So the trick is to sew a zigzag stitch all the way down. The foam is like a sponge. When you press down, it flattens. The zigzag stitch will make it really easy to turn the fabric over and it will look neat. Do not cut it off because there won't be anything to turn it over to. Let's sew. This is how the foam is going to look, nice and flat. Next, we're going to take the fabric and flip it over. Then put some pins so the fabric doesn't move. After that, press the top of the cup so it lays flat. Your cup will look like this. Then sew 1/4 around the whole cup so it doesn't move. Next, put the fabric and lining right side to right side and sew only on the top of the corset. I sewed a 1/2 inch seam allowance. After that, sew a understitch on top of the corset. A understitch holds down the lining so it doesn't move to the front. Once you flip it over, you're going to sew it right over here so that it doesn't move. Remember, there's 2 pieces, so when you're sewing the cup, you don't want the fabric and the lining to move. In this video, you will learn a couple of things I like to do to make a clean, neat corset. So when I'm sewing the foam cups, I don't like to sew it like this. I only sew it like this in certain situations, like in method 6 and 7. The reason why I like to sew it on the other side is because I like to make sure there's no puckers or fabric sewn together. And if one decides to build up, I can lift the foot up and fix it. Take your time sewing the cups. Here is another tip that's important. You can make bias tape and use it for the underwire channel, but you have to be careful which one you're using. These are pre-made underwire channels. They are from different companies. This one is thick and this one feels a little bit more silkier. I like this one better. You can also make them in different sizes. I use a bias tape tool to make them. This one is a 1/2 inch and this one is 3/8. If you put these together, you're going to notice they are the same size. The pre-made ones from the stores are usually 3/8. Do they work? Yes, they do. But when I'm making a corset with a lot of layers, I like to use the 1/2" bias tape because the corset is too thick and sometimes the 3/8 won't work. It will be too small to close. Here is another important tip. Always curve your bias tape or your pre-made underwire channels. If you skip this part in the corset making, you will be upset with the finished look. The curve will ease the tightness on the bottom of the front bust cups. When you iron it, press it up like this because it can shrink the top of the tape and make it smaller. So you want to press it up like this. You can also buy the pre-made bias tape. I love this company. There's other companies that sell bias tape like on Amazon or Etsy, but this name brand is really good. It's so neat and I love it. Here is another tip. This tip you don't have to do, but it works for me sometimes, so I wanted to share it with you. Before I sew the bias tape, I usually stitch this area twice to make sure that it's secured. After I do that, I unstitch the bias tape here and here. The reason why I do that, it's because this is really thick. We have lining, bias tape, fabric, 5mm foam, and bias tape. It's too thick. I like to unstitch it on the sides too. Even though it's not thick on the sides, I still do it. I double stitch before cutting it. Before we start cutting it, we have to sew the bias tape first. Put the bias tape right on top of the 1/2" seam allowance. We're going to sew it 1/8 away from the bias tape edge. Take your time sewing this part. Also, make sure the fabric is not bunching up underneath. Let's sew. The next step is to make sure everything looks good. Check to see if there's any puckers. Then check on the front to make sure you didn't sew on top of the 1/2" seam allowance, but you sewed it 1/8 away from that 1/2" seam allowance. You will see if you made a mistake right here. Once you're satisfied with the look, then you can cut off the little bias tape that's inside if you want. Then from there, cut off the foam about 1/4. Cut enough off so that the bias tape can lay flat and close, and you can sew over it without it being bulky. If you feel that 1/4 is not enough, then cut a little bit more, but be careful not to cut off all of it, okay guys? Here's another tip. When it comes to making a corset with multiple layers, it would be a good idea to base the end of the underwire channel. So when you're sewing in the front, you know where the end is. Some people like to sew it from the back, and that's okay, but make sure the lines in the front are not crooked. I honestly think sewing it from the front is better. You have more control of what's going on. Let's sew. Slow down when you get to the seam right here, so you can sew through the bulkiness. Take your time so that the needle can sew through the underwire. Try to flatten the underwire, then sew. This is the front and the back. Now you can put your underwire in. I will not sew the top of the underwire closed because I realize I only have one pair of underwire for this video, so I will be using it for all 8 methods. Here is the final look. Did you learn anything from method 1? And are you ready for method 2? Let's go. For method 2, we are going to use the same pattern for the fabric and for the foam, but we're going to sew it differently. These are the fabric pieces for method 2. For this method, you're going to sew the cups the same way we sewed it in method 1, but this time we will sew the cup to the front, not the back. So the first thing we will do is curve the bias tape like we did in method 1. Then sew it to the cups. Make sure there's no puckers underneath the cup. After that, cut off the pieces and the foam like we did in method 1 and sew the bias tape closed. This is the front and back. And here is the final look for method 2. Do you like the underwire in the front of the corset or the back? I actually like it in the front, but let me know what you think in the comments. Next is method 3. For method 3, we will put a 1/2 inch seam allowance on the top and everywhere else on the fabric and lining pattern. For the foam, we're going to put a 1/2 inch seam allowance here, 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 and here. These are the fabric pieces for method 3. The first thing we're going to do is sew the bust cup to the main fabric a 1/2 inch. The next step is to clip around the cup about 1/4. Then turn it over and sew 1/4 all around the cup. Let me show you what I mean. The seam allowance is a 1/2 inch. If you look closely, you will see that I clipped about 1/4 and sewed it in the front 1/4. After that, turn the lining and the cup to the front. Then sew it a 1/2 inch all around the cup. This is what it should look like. Check to make sure there's no puckers around the cup. Once you're satisfied, then use the iron and curve the bias tape. After that, put the bias tape on top of the 1/2 inch seam allowance on the cup and sew 1/8 away from the edge of the bias tape. Then cut off 1/4 of the foam and sew it at the edge of the bias tape, which becomes the underwire channel. I decided to put the boning on the lining this time, but you can put it on the main fabric or the lining. It's all up to you. This is the underwire. The shorter side always goes in the front and the longer side goes in the back. Put the underwire in the channel and it has to be a 1/2 inch shorter than the cup on both sides because the seam allowance on the top is a 1/2 inch. After that, put the main fabric and lining right side to right side and sew the top of the corset a 1/2 inch. Once you sew the top of your corset, you can flip it over and sew a zigzag stitch on the edge of the foam to flatten it like we did in method 1. I usually cut off some of the fabric on top of my corsets, but for this method I didn't. I wanted to keep the top the way it is and just flip it over and do a understitch to make sure the lining doesn't move to the front. This is the front and the back. I don't use this method much, but when I do use it, it's for a client that has a full chest. Next is method 4. This time we will put a 1/2 inch seam allowance all around the fabric and lining. And for the foam, there will be no seam allowance on the top. Just put seam allowance on the sides and the bottom. These are the fabric pieces for method 4. For the foam cups, I will be using fusible bonding web, but you can also use hem and tape strips. It's all up to you. On the bust cup, use a pencil and write a 1/2 inch seam allowance on top. I like using this fusible bonding web. It covers the whole piece of foam. You can cut slits so that it lays down better on the foam cup. Next, put the foam inside the bust cup like this. Make sure it's not touching the seam allowance on the top. What I like to do is put pins on the inside of the cup so it doesn't move when I iron it. Now let me show you this tailor's bra pressing hem. Oh my God, I really love this. It's so cute and nice and it's hard on the top. I use it all the time. My cups really be cupping. Next, press on the cup so that the glue sticks to the inside of the cup. I like to use the steam. Always check to see if it's glued before you take out the pins. Once you feel comfortable with the cup, take the pins out and press around the cup to take the dents out the cup. This is how the inside will look and this is the front. Next, take your lining and put it on top of the cup right side to right side. Then sew a 1/2 inch on the top. After that, turn it over and sew a understitch right here. This is the understitch. Put your hand in the middle of the cup and lay the lining flat around the edges. Put pins so it doesn't move. Then sew a basting stitch about 1/4. Whatever extra lining is out the cup, cut it off. You don't need it. Sew the main fabric and the lining together. Then understitch the top of your corset. After that, sew 1/8 all around here. Take your cup and sew it all around a 1/2 inch. Then check to see if there's any puckers and curve the bias tape like we did in method 1. Take the bias tape and put it right on top of the 1/2 inch seam allowance and sew 1/8 away from the bias tape edge. It's now used as an underwire channel. Then cut the foam about 1/4 all the way around. This is how much I cut off. You want to cut off 1/4 or a little bit more so that when you close it, that area is empty and you can sew on top of it, especially here at the seam. This area is important. This is the thickest area. It has a lot of layers. Just be careful cutting off the foam. You don't want to make a mistake and cut it off next to the seam allowance. Also, I like to baste it closed with a white thread. It helps me a little bit. Let's sew. For this method, I left the foam on the bottom. In method 6, you could leave the seam allowance on the bottom or take it off. But for this method, I wouldn't suggest taking it off. So you definitely need some structure on the bottom of this cup area. But more about this in a little while. Now let's talk about this lining. I have another way to do it in the next method, and you're probably going to like that one more than this one. It's one of my favorites I like to do. So here is the final look for method 4. Let me know if you like this one. Now let's jump into method 5. For method 5, we will use 3/8 and 3/8 on the top, only for the fabric, and a 1/2 inch all the way around. But for this pattern, we're going to use it for the foam and the lining. No seam allowance on the top, just on the sides and the bottom. These are the pattern pieces for method 5. The first thing we're going to do is put the lining and main fabric right side to right side. Sew a 1/2 inch on top of the corset. Then flip it over and sew a understitch on top. After that, sew a 1/8 inch around here so it doesn't move when you're sewing the cup. It's going to look like this. This is the front and back. Here is the understitch on top. And I sewed around here 1/8. The main fabric will have interfacing. The next step is the foam cups. For this method, I will be using fusible bonding web, but you can also use hemming tape. It's all up to you. I'm going to use this one. Take the fusible web and put it in the back of the cup. Then put the lining on top, wrong side to wrong side, and iron it. Do this to all the pieces. Here is the back of the foam, and this is the inside. Next, put the pieces together and sew a zigzag stitch. This is the back of the cup and the inside. Next, sew a bias tape on top to cover the zigzag stitch. This is how the back looks and the inside. Take your bust cup and put it in the back of the foam like this and sew a 3/8 stitch. Then flip it over and sew a zigzag stitch at the end of the foam to flatten it, like we did in method 1. Once you do that, sew a 1/8 stitch around the bottom of the cup so the fabric and foam becomes one piece. This is one of my favorite methods. I like it because you can use the same fabric as the bust cup or different fabric. One thing about me, I like to spice things up. Now take your bust cup and sew it like this, a 1/2 inch all around. Then sew the bias tape like we did in the previous method. This is the front and back. And here is the final look for method 5. Let me know, guys, what do you think? Do you like the blue one or this one? Next is method 6. We're going to put a 1/2 inch seam allowance all around the fabric and lining. But for the foam, there'll be no seam allowance around the foam. These are the fabric pieces for method 6. The first thing we're going to do is put the fusible bonding web on the inside of the foam. Then use a pencil and write a 1/2 inch all around the cup. After that, put the foam inside and iron it. Make sure it doesn't touch around the seam allowance. For method 4, I left the foam on the bottom of the cup for some more stability. But for this method, you can take the foam off on the bottom or leave it on. It's up to you. You're probably asking yourself, what's the difference? Well, I think it's actually the way the lining is sewn. In method 4, the lining and fabric is sewn as one piece. But in this method, the lining and fabric is sewn separately. But let me know what you think. Once it's glued to the cup, then sew it a 1/2 inch all around. For method 1 through 5, there was foam on the bust cup seam allowance. When I leave the foam seam allowance, I like to sew on the other side to prevent any puckers. But when I take the seam allowance off the bottom of the foam and write the seam allowance on the bust cup, that's when I sew it on this side, so I can see the seam allowance line when I'm sewing on top of it. I don't want to sew on top of the foam, and I sew very slow and check underneath to make sure there's no fabric sticking together. After that, clip around the curve about 1/4 so it can lay flat. Then sew a 1/4 stitch in the front. It will look like this. This is for putting the underwire in the cup. Next, clip around the lining and sew a 1/2 inch on the top of the corset. Then flip it over and do an understitch on top. This is the front and back. For this method, you don't have to put a underwire if you don't want to, but I think it's best if you have one. This method is for beginners. Beginners usually start with this method because this is the easiest one to do, but I'm trying to get beginners to move up to another method so they are comfortable making bust cups. If you are a beginner and you have a question, I'm right here. Leave your question in the comment section and I'll answer it as soon as possible. Alright, now let's get into method 7. This one is going to be quick. It's the bust caging method. I made a video on how to sew the ridgeline boning. I will leave a playlist of all the bust cups I made at the end of this video. After making a bust cage, take the cup and sew it on this 1/2 inch line right here. This is how the inside looks. Sometimes the glue likes to unglue, so what I like to do is sew 1/8 around the cup before I sew the cup to the main fabric so it doesn't move. After I sew the cup, I clip around the seam allowance about 1/4 so the seam can lay flat. Next is the important part. We have to cover the ridgeline boning so that it doesn't irritate the client's breast. To cover the cup, you need light interfacing and polyester batting. I usually use 1/2 of this. First, put the batting inside the cup, push it in the middle of the cup. Then put a pin inside an area that doesn't have ridgeline boning. We are going to cut at the 1/2 inch seam allowance line right here. You can use a pencil and mark it, or you can just start cutting around it. You can actually see right through the batting. But, hear me out designers, please be careful cutting. Do not cut the corset cup seam allowance off. We do not want that, okay? Let's continue. So when you finish cutting around the batting, take the pins out, and this is what it should look like. Next, take the interfacing and lay the glue inside the cup. Start from the middle and put 2 pins in the middle so it doesn't move. From there, you're going to notice you have a little extra interfacing here. Just cut a line and lay it flat like this. After that, cut around the interfacing. Try to have enough interfacing to cover the whole cup, because when we start pressing the middle, it could get shorter and you won't have enough to cover the whole cup. The next step is to pin all around the cup. Pin the middle first and then pin all around. After that, start pressing the cup inside like this. Once you feel like it's glued inside, then you can flip the cup inside out to press it flat some more. And this is how it should look, nice and neat. Once it's glued together, always sew 1/4 around the cup right here, just in case the glue decides to unglue. The batting and interfacing will stay in place with the 1/4 stitch, so please make sure you don't forget this important step. Next, put the lining and fabric right side to right side and sew a 1/2 inch on top. Then flip it over and do an understitch on top. This is the back and front. I use this method when a client has a full bust. A cut and sew bra foam may not be able to hold up a full chest, So I use this bust caging when a client has a D cup and higher. Sometimes I will do it for a C cup, but it depends on the situation. Next is method 8. You guys are gonna like this one. For the fabric and lining pattern, we will put a 1/2 inch seam allowance all around, except for the top. For the top, we will put 3/8 and 3/8. And for the foam, there will be a 1/2 inch seam allowance around the cup, but not inside or on the top. So the first step is to put the foam and fabric right side to right side and sew a 3/8 stitch. Then flip it over and sew a zigzag stitch on the top edge of the foam, like we did in method 1 and 2. Next, put the lining and fabric right side to right side and sew a 1/2 inch on the top and curve of the corset. Then clip all around the inside of the corset like this. From there, you're going to understitch all around the top and curve of the corset. Keep in mind that we won't be able to understitch next to the corners on the top. So do what you can to make sure you did the understitching on the curve so that the lining doesn't move to the front. Now let's work on the cup. Sew a 1/2 inch around the cup, then take the edge of the curved bias tape and put it on the 1/2 inch stitch right here. After that, sew 1/8 away from the edge of the bias tape. Next, take the corset and put it on the stitch. Make sure you don't see the stitch. It has to be right on top of the stitch. So what we're going to do is start with matching up the 2 seams right here. Then put a pin. Do the same thing for the front and back of the cup. We are going to sew it 1/8 away from the edge. So take your time sewing it. I say this because the underbust part will try to move above the stitch, especially when you turn it at the curve. So you have to keep making sure you're sewing right over the stitch so you don't see it. This is how it looks so far. Next, cut the foam about 1/4. I cut off the 3 little pieces of bias tape first. You don't have to do that if you don't want to, but it does help a little bit from being bulky. Once you cut the foam off, then sew 1/4 away from the edge like this. Here is the front and the back. I want to show you guys something. If this happens to you when you're sewing on the underwire channel, don't panic. It's okay. It happens sometimes because of the foam. As long as the wire can go through, you're good to go. All you have to do right here is sew an invisible stitch. See, everything else is closed. It's just right here, and that's fine. Once you sew an invisible stitch, you can put the wire in and close the top of the channel. If this video was helpful to you guys, let me know in the comments. Please give this video a like and share it so it can help other creators who want to learn about bust cups. Here is the playlist for sewing the bust cage. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Don't forget to practice, practice, practice. Bye, everybody.